What if the oldest story humanity ever told didn't begin in the heavens, but under the African sun? What if the people history calls forgotten were once the very ones the gods feared would remember too much? And what if the past you were taught was edited, not to simplify it, but to control what you'd never think to question? Tonight, we return to a truth buried beneath sand, scripture, and silence. A lineage whispered about in myths, hinted at in forbidden texts, and quietly erased from official timelines. They were called many things: radiant, chosen, dangerous. But one name survived the fire: the children of the sun. This is not a story about mythology alone. It's about how ancient African civilizations understood light, power, memory, and the human spirit in ways that still unsettle the modern world, and why those truths were fractured, renamed, and scattered across continents. As you listen, you may feel something familiar, like déjà vu without a memory. That's not coincidence, that's resonance. If this story speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from, because these revelations were never meant for one place alone. The old storytellers say it always starts with a question people aren't supposed to ask. Not shouted, not written in stone, but whispered at dawn when the world is still honest. What if the first great fear of the gods wasn't chaos, but memory? What if there was a people who remembered too much, too early, and paid the price for it? Long before borders, before scriptures were edited and footnotes politely erased, there were lands where the sun didn't just rise, it instructed. And funny enough, most official timelines rush past that part. Coincidence, they say. Progress, they call it. Still, the silence around those early African civilizations feels less like ignorance and more like deliberate amnesia. The elders spoke of humans who didn't kneel by default, who looked at the sky not with submission, but recognition. They weren't waiting for salvation. They were carrying something already awake inside them. That idea, unsurprisingly, didn't age well in later doctrines. History, after all, tends to favor stories where power flows in one direction only. So the question lingered, passed through drum beats and breath, hidden in proverbs and ritual songs. Why were these people described as radiant, burning, too close to the divine? And why do so many later texts suddenly change the tone, turning reverence into warning, light into danger? Somewhere between reverence and fear, a line was crossed. And once that line was crossed, the story had to change. Not all at once, of course, slowly, subtly, wrapped in new names and safer explanations. But the sun was still watching, rising over the same land, waiting for the next piece of the story to be remembered. The land itself remembered first. Long before it was called Africa, before maps tried to tame it with lines, this continent breathed with rivers that knew their own names. The Nile, the Niger, the Congo. They weren't just water, they were memory moving. Civilizations rose along their banks not by accident, but by listening, aligning stone and spirit with the rhythms of the earth. Archaeology, when it dares to be honest, confirms what the old voices always said. Cities like Nabta Playa aligned stones to the solstices thousands of years before Stonehenge. In the Nile Valley, societies mastered astronomy, medicine, and governance, while much of the world was still learning to count seasons. Yet somehow, this chapter is often rushed, summarized, or politely minimized. Strange how early doesn't always mean important in official history. To the people who lived there, geography was theology. Deserts weren't empty, they were thresholds. Mountains were elders. The sun didn't dominate the sky, it conversed with the land. Every horizon held meaning, every cycle was sacred, and time itself wasn't linear but circular, returning knowledge to those patient enough to observe. This intimacy with place shaped a worldview that unsettled outsiders. Power didn't descend from distant heavens alone. It rose from soil, blood, and breath. Authority was earned through harmony, not conquest. And that kind of balance, inconveniently, doesn't translate well into empires built on control. As centuries passed and new powers arrived, the land was renamed, remeasured, reinterpreted. But beneath the dust and rewritten labels, the old alignments still hum. Stones still point to the sun, rivers still follow ancestral paths. And the stage was set for a people whose bond with the sun would soon be remembered not as wisdom, but as a threat. They were known in fragments, scattered across myths and broken tablets. People described not by crowns or weapons, but by light. Not metaphorical light, not poetic exaggeration, but something closer, heavier. Ancient texts spoke of skin that absorbed the sun, eyes that reflected it, bodies said to be tuned rather than ruled. Modern scholars tend to clear their throats at this point and move on quickly. Too uncomfortable, perhaps, or too inconvenient. In the Nile Valley, in Nubia, across the Sahel, solar symbolism wasn't decoration. It was identity. The sun was not above them. It moved through them. Kings ruled as sons of Ra, not as intermediaries begging favor, but as extensions of a cosmic order. And yes, that sounds dangerously close to divinity for human beings. Funny how that idea later became heresy. Rituals marked this bond carefully. At dawn, bodies faced east in silence. At noon, shadows were studied like scripture. These weren't superstitions. They were systems, astronomical, biological, spiritual, observed over generations. The body itself became a calendar, a compass, a living archive of solar cycles. Some legends go further, hinting that these people didn't just worship the sun. They remembered coming from it, not in fire or flame, but in essence. Stories tell of ancestors who arrived already knowing how to build, heal, and govern, as if knowledge had been carried across a threshold rather than discovered by chance. That's usually where the footnotes end and the dismissals begin. Because if humans could carry that kind of light without permission, then the hierarchy collapses. Gods lose their monopoly, power loses its distance, and suddenly the children of the sun aren't poetic at all. They're a problem, a truth too bright to sit comfortably in rewritten timelines, waiting quietly for the next veil to be lifted. In the oldest layers of memory, before temples wore names and gods wore crowns, the sun was not a ruler. It was a witness. African tradition spoke of a time when humans and divine forces rose together, shaped by the same pulse. Not created as servants, not engineered for obedience, but awakened alongside the cosmos itself. That detail rarely survives translation. It makes later hierarchies feel manufactured. Across Kemet, Kush and beyond, creation stories described emergence, not fabrication. Humanity didn't fall from grace, it stepped into awareness. The sun marked that moment, not as a father figure handing down commands, but as a signal, now it begins. Compare that quietly with later creation myths elsewhere, where humans arrive fragile, guilty, already kneeling. Different starting points tend to produce very different power structures. Priesthoods guarded this memory carefully. Initiation wasn't about learning who to obey, but remembering who you were before forgetting became policy. Through fasting, darkness, heat, and rhythm, initiates were stripped of illusion until something older surfaced. The sun crowned the process at the end, not as a reward, but as confirmation. Some surviving hymns hint at an uncomfortable idea. The divine wasn't separate from humanity at first. It walked, breathed, learned. Over time, that closeness became dangerous. When humans no longer needed intermediaries, authority began to feel threatened. And authority, as history shows, doesn't age well when questioned, so the stories shifted. Proximity to the divine became arrogance. Memory became rebellion, and the sun, once a shared source, was elevated, distanced, turned into something humans were no longer allowed to touch. But the echo of that earlier truth lingered, glowing quietly beneath rituals and ruins, waiting for the next layer of the story to crack open. They encoded the knowledge where fire and time couldn't reach it, into symbols. Not decorative ones, not random art, but precise visual languages meant to survive collapse. The solar disk, the coiled serpent, the open eye, the crossed arms facing east, each carried layers of instruction. Later cultures copied the shapes, stripped the meaning and called it influence. The originals called it memory preservation. In stone reliefs and ceremonial objects, the sun appears paired with serpents again and again, not by chance. The serpent marked energy, circulation, regeneration. The sun marked order and consciousness. Together, they formed a system, life force guided by awareness. Modern viewers see myth. Ancient Africans saw mechanics. It's ironic how science eventually circles back to ideas it once mocked. Clothing, body paint, and architecture followed the same code. Colors were chosen for frequency, not fashion. Gold wasn't luxury. It was conductive, solar, alive. Temples aligned with solstices weren't impressive because they were big, but because they were accurate. Stone listened. Light responded. Ritual completed the circuit. These symbols weren't meant for everyone. Some knowledge required maturity, discipline, and silence. That exclusivity later became an easy target. Outsiders labeled it secrecy, even sorcery. But selective teaching isn't deception, it's responsibility. Not every truth survives careless hands. When empires fell and names changed, the symbols stayed, sometimes hidden in plain sight, sometimes demonized, sometimes renamed to feel safer. But they never stopped working. And as those signs continued to surface across continents, a new tension quietly formed. Because symbols that travel usually carry a story someone tried very hard to erase. The turning point didn't arrive with thunder. It came quietly, wrapped in admiration that slowly curdled into fear. As outsiders encountered these solar-centered societies, they were impressed, then unsettled. A people who organized cities without divine kings towering above them, who treated light as inheritance rather than permission, didn't fit the expected order. And history has a habit of punishing what it can't categorize. Old inscriptions hint at this tension without spelling it out. References to watchers, sky beings, or distant authorities appear suddenly, often alongside warnings. The tone shifts. What was once partnership becomes hierarchy. What was once shared knowledge becomes restricted. It's subtle, but it's there, right where the myths stop celebrating and start cautioning. Later texts from other regions echo the same anxiety. Stories of humans who lived too long, knew too much, reached too high. Funny how that narrative keeps repeating. Whether they're called giants, demigods, or fallen ones, the message stays consistent. Proximity to power is dangerous when it's not controlled. In Africa, this fear manifested differently. Instead of floods or fire from the sky, the response was gradual isolation. Traditions were fragmented, lineages were broken, knowledge was compartmentalized. The sun remained, but access to its deeper meaning narrowed, not destroyed, just carefully gated. Because outright erasure leaves traces, controlled forgetting doesn't. And as the world reorganized around new centers of authority, the children of the sun were no longer framed as enlightened. They became cautionary figures, powerful, yes, but allegedly needing restraint. A convenient rewrite, really, setting the stage for the next chapter of distortion that would follow. The real damage didn't come from myths, it came from management. When foreign belief systems arrived with banners, books, and certainty, they didn't just challenge African cosmologies, they reorganized them. What couldn't be absorbed was labeled dangerous. What couldn't be controlled was renamed. Suddenly, solar rites became idolatry, ancestral science became superstition, and memory itself was treated like a disease that needed curing. Ironically, many of the new doctrines borrowed heavily from what they condemned. Flood stories, chosen lineages, sacred mountains, divine law, none of it was new. It was familiar, just repackaged with different accents and firmer rules. Yet acknowledgement was off the table. Admitting origin would have meant admitting debt, and empires aren't great at humility. Colonial rule accelerated the process. Languages were suppressed, oral historians dismissed, sacred sites repurposed or destroyed. Education was reframed to prioritize forgetting efficiently. Generations were taught to look outward for truth and upward for permission, while being quietly discouraged from looking back or within. Still, fragments survived, in drum patterns mistaken for music, in hairstyles dismissed as style, in proverbs passed off as folklore. These weren't accidents, they were storage devices, cultural encryption hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when listening became safer than silence. And that moment didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through cracks, through curiosity, through restlessness, through a growing sense that something vital was missing. As the old symbols resurfaced across continents, questions began forming again. And once questions return, forgetting becomes a lot harder to maintain. Tone doesn't lie easily. Beneath layers of sand and selective curiosity, Africa kept receipts. Nabta Playa's stone circles still track the stars with unsettling precision. The pyramids of Kush rise quietly in Sudan, older than many care to admit, aligned to solar paths that modern instruments now confirm. Funny how the Earth keeps remembering what textbooks hesitate to explain. Artifacts began surfacing that didn't fit the narrative of late development. Surgical tools, astronomical charts, metallurgical techniques appearing far earlier than expected and far too refined. The usual response followed: coincidence, diffusion, mystery. Safe words, really. Words that sound scientific while buying time. Even rock art complicated things. Figures with radiant heads, elongated forms, gestures toward the sky, dismissed as fantasy by some, symbolic by others. Yet the repetition across regions suggests continuity, not imagination. When symbols repeat over thousands of miles and years, they're usually saying something specific. Oral traditions filled the gaps archaeology couldn't. Elders spoke of cities swallowed by sand, of knowledge moved underground when it became unsafe. These weren't stories of loss alone, they were strategies, preservation through disappearance, survival through silence. As technology finally caught up, scans and surveys started revealing buried structures, forgotten roads, erased settlements. And with every discovery came a quiet discomfort. Because the more Africa's past surfaced, the harder it became to argue it was ever empty. And once the land starts speaking again, the next mystery isn't what was built, but why so much effort went into pretending it never existed. The knowledge didn't vanish when the people were scattered. It traveled, stitched into memory, rhythm, and breath. Across the Atlantic, across deserts and borders, fragments of the old solar codes resurfaced in unexpected places. Drums echoed the same pulse once used in rituals. Songs carried layered meanings, sounding like sorrow on the surface, instruction underneath. Funny how survival often disguises itself as art. In the Americas, indigenous traditions spoke of sun-born ancestors arriving from the east. In the Andes, solar deities ruled time and agriculture, with rules strikingly familiar. Even in Mesoamerica, calendars, pyramids, and bloodlines echoed patterns long established in Africa. Scholars debate independent development, which sounds reasonable, until the similarities line up a little too neatly. Biblical texts, when read without filters, whisper similar threads. Chosen peoples, radiant figures, divine law tied to light, genealogies traced back to sun-drenched lands. Some passages feel borrowed, others carefully edited. Ironically, the more literal the reading, the more uncomfortable the origins become. This doesn't mean everything came from one place, but it does suggest conversation, exchange, memory moving with people. And for a long time, that idea was treated like heresy, because admitting shared roots disrupts hierarchies built on separation. So the connections were labeled coincidence again. Parallel myth, parallel symbol, parallel architecture. Safe explanations, but parallels don't explain transmission scars, only travel does. And somewhere between Africa and the rest of the world, the children of the sun left fingerprints that still glow faintly, waiting for the next layer of recognition to be peeled back. Even stripped of land, name and language, the body remembered. The rhythms survived in muscle and marrow, responding instinctively to drums, to claps, to the rise and fall of voice. What had once been ceremony became culture, then entertainment, a softer word that made it easier to ignore the depth beneath it. Still, the patterns stayed intact, waiting. Spiritual practices adapted quietly. Ancestors became saints. Solar cycles hid inside religious calendars. Call and response echoed initiation chants, now dressed in new theology. Ironically, some of the loudest critics never noticed they were kneeling inside borrowed structures, repeating gestures far older than the doctrines they defended. Resistance movements carried the same imprint. From maroon communities to liberation songs, there was always a current of remembrance, not nostalgia, orientation, a sense of knowing where strength came from, even when the source couldn't be named out loud. That scared authorities more than weapons ever did. Modern psychology would later call it collective memory. Biology would hint at epigenetics. Spiritual tradition simply called it inheritance. Trauma passed down, yes, but so was wisdom. So was orientation toward light, toward survival, toward balance. The sun never stopped rising in the internal landscape, and as the modern world began asking new questions about identity, origin, belonging, those dormant codes stirred again. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to make people pause and wonder why certain symbols still resonate, why certain rhythms still heal. And that curiosity, once awakened, rarely stays contained for long. Science eventually wandered into the conversation, pretending it hadn't been invited. Studies on circadian rhythms confirmed what solar traditions already practiced. Human biology responds to light with precision. Melanin, once reduced to a social label, revealed itself as something far more complex: protective, conductive, responsive. Funny how the body keeps proving ancient systems right centuries later without asking for permission. The pineal gland, long mystified, showed sensitivity to light and electromagnetic fields. Modern labs called it regulation. Elders once called it sight. Different words, same function. Yet when ancestral explanations surface, they're often treated as poetic at best, dangerous at worst, as if truth becomes less valid the moment it's remembered outside approved institutions. Medical texts now acknowledge vitamin D, sunlight exposure, and mental health as deeply connected. Sleep, mood, immunity, all dancing to a solar rhythm. None of this is radical anymore. What's radical is admitting that entire civilizations structured life around these principles long before microscopes existed. The irony sharpens here. Practices once outlawed or mocked now reappear as wellness. Fasting, sun exposure, grounding, rhythm-based therapy, rebranded, monetized, sanitized, stripped of lineage but suddenly acceptable. Progress has a strange way of rediscovering what it once tried to bury. And as science inches closer to ancestral truth, a quiet tension grows. Because validation raises an uncomfortable question. If they were right about the body, what else were they right about? And what happens when modern certainty finally has to sit down with ancient memory and listen? Power never forgets what once challenged it. As conversations about ancestry, identity, and memory resurfaced, so did the old discomfort. Movements reclaiming African spirituality, history, and symbolism were often met with ridicule or fear. Too mystical, too political, too dangerous, labels recycled from earlier centuries, polished to sound modern. Same reflex, different language. In media and policy, certain awakenings were encouraged, others quietly discouraged. Celebrate culture, they said, but not consciousness. Dance, but don't remember why. Speak pride, but don't trace it too far back. Because once people reconnect lineage with power, the narrative of dependency starts to crack. Across the diaspora, this tension showed itself in subtle ways. Education reforms stalled, spiritual practices were monitored, symbols were commodified while their meanings were flattened. It wasn't oppression in chains, it was management through distraction. Much cleaner, much harder to point at, yet the pull toward origin kept growing. Not out of anger, but out of hunger. A need to understand why certain stories resonated deeper, why certain truths felt familiar without explanation. Identity, after all, isn't taught, it's remembered. And as more people began asking who they were before being told who to be, the old fear stirred again. Because the return of memory doesn't announce itself as rebellion. It arrives as clarity. And clarity has a habit of undoing carefully constructed illusions, one quiet realization at a time. What unsettled the old systems most wasn't anger. It was calm recognition. When people begin to remember without rage, without asking permission, the usual tools stop working. The children of the sun were never loud about it. Their strength showed in posture, in silence, in an unshakable sense of self that no decree could fully erase. Ancient teachings warned about this moment. They said memory would return in cycles, not catastrophes. First through curiosity, then through study, then through quiet alignment. No armies, no prophets screaming from hills, just individuals reconnecting dots that were never meant to stay hidden forever. Across universities, archives, and spiritual circles, questions multiplied. Why do African timelines start late in textbooks? Why are pyramids plural only when they're not in Africa? Why does so much sacred symbolism trace back to the same solar logic? These weren't accusations, just observations, and observations are dangerous when they're accurate. Elders once said the sun doesn't force revelation, it waits until the eyes are ready. That's why awakening feels personal, almost private. A book found at the right time, a ruin seen differently, a ritual suddenly making sense. Nothing dramatic, just alignment clicking into place. And as that alignment spreads quietly, it signals something older than resistance. It signals return, not to a golden age, not to domination, but to orientation. And once orientation is restored, the next mystery isn't whether the past was hidden, but how much of it is already waking up right now. The elders used to say the sun never crowned kings, it revealed them. Leadership wasn't inherited through blood alone, but through balance. A ruler out of rhythm with the people or the land didn't last long. That idea didn't survive contact well. External powers preferred authority that could be enforced, not earned, which made the old model quietly inconvenient. In early African societies, power flowed horizontally before it rose vertically. Councils, priesthoods, astronomers, and healers shared responsibility. Governance followed cosmic order, seasons, cycles, return. When that system worked, there was little room for tyranny. When it didn't, correction came from within. No divine right speeches required. As new empires expanded, this structure was misunderstood or deliberately misread. Shared power was framed as weakness. Spiritual authority without centralized control was labeled chaos. Ironically, The same systems that produced stability for centuries were dismissed as primitive by forces that couldn't replicate them. Yet traces remained. In village councils, in consensus-based traditions, in proverbs warning against leaders who lose alignment with the sun and soil. These weren't metaphors, they were safeguards, political science before it needed a name. And as modern societies wrestle with failing systems and restless populations, those older models start to feel uncomfortably relevant. Almost as if the past left blueprints behind on purpose. The question now isn't whether those systems existed, but whether the world is ready to remember why they worked. Time has a way of circling back when it's been ignored for too long. Beneath universities, beneath temples, beneath the language of progress, the old questions are resurfacing. Not out of rebellion, but necessity. Systems are cracking, identities feel hollow, and suddenly the past doesn't seem so backward anymore. It starts to whisper instead of shout. Young scholars return to original texts instead of translations. Artists pull symbols from dreams they were never taught. Spiritual seekers feel drawn to practices they can't name, but somehow recognize. Funny thing, when memory returns organically, it doesn't feel foreign, it feels like relief. Technology, of all things, accelerates this revival. Satellite imagery reveals forgotten cities. DNA studies complicate simple migration stories. Digital archives expose edits, omissions, and convenient gaps. The tools meant to finalize history end up reopening it. Irony has excellent timing. Elders once warned that remembrance wouldn't look mystical at first, it would look practical. Questions about health, governance, land, and spirit would quietly lead people back to solar logic, ancestral balance, and communal orientation. No rituals required, just attention. And as this return unfolds, it doesn't announce an ending. It opens a door, because if fragments are resurfacing now, it suggests something larger was always meant to follow. Something the sun has been patient enough to wait for, just beyond the next horizon of remembering. Time has a way of circling back when it's been ignored for too long. Beneath universities, beneath temples, beneath the language of progress, the old questions are resurfacing. Not out of rebellion, but necessity. Systems are cracking, identities feel hollow, and suddenly the past doesn't seem so backward anymore. It starts to whisper instead of shout. Young scholars return to original texts instead of translations. Artists pull symbols from dreams they were never taught. Spiritual seekers feel drawn to practices they can't name but somehow recognize. Funny thing, when memory returns organically, it doesn't feel foreign. It feels like relief. Technology, of all things, accelerates this revival. Satellite imagery reveals forgotten cities. DNA studies complicate simple migration stories. Digital archives expose edits, omissions, and convenient gaps. The tools meant to finalize history end up reopening it. Irony has excellent timing. Elders once warned that remembrance wouldn't look mystical at first. It would look practical. Questions about health, governance, land, and spirit would quietly lead people back to solar logic, ancestral balance, and communal orientation. No rituals required, just attention. And as this return unfolds, it doesn't announce an ending, it opens a door. Because if fragments are resurfacing now, it suggests something larger was always meant to follow. Something the sun has been patient enough to wait for, just beyond the next horizon of remembering. Even now, the story resists being boxed into the past. It breathes in the present tense. The children of the sun were never meant to be ancestors only. They were a pattern, a way of standing in the world, of relating to power, to nature, to the unseen. That's why the narrative keeps resurfacing whenever societies lose their sense of direction. Across the globe, people with no shared language feel the same pull toward origin, toward land, toward rhythm, toward meaning that doesn't need constant enforcement. It shows up in the search for sustainable living, spiritual autonomy, communal care. New words, old instincts. The sun hasn't changed, only the way it's been explained. Ironically, the more global the world becomes, the more localized memory feels necessary. Homogenized systems leave people starving for depth. And depth, inconveniently, lives in places once dismissed as primitive. The contradiction is hard to ignore, which is why it's often laughed off instead. The elders would have smiled at this moment. They taught that remembrance isn't dramatic, it's practical. It doesn't arrive as prophecy, but as alignment. When people stop asking what they're allowed to know and start asking what feels true, the old pathways reopen naturally. So the story doesn't demand belief. It invites recognition. And as long as the sun continues to rise over the same land that once held these truths openly, the legacy remains unfinished, quietly waiting for whoever is ready to carry it forward into whatever comes next. Some traditions say the final test of memory is restraint. Not everyone who remembers is meant to speak, and not everything remembered is meant to be displayed. The children of the sun understood that visibility attracts control. So wisdom learned to move softly, like heat under sand, present, shaping, but unseen. In ancient councils, silence was considered a skill. Elders listened longer than they spoke, weighing not just words but timing. Knowledge revealed too early could be weaponized. Revealed too late, it could be lost. That balance shaped how stories were told, never straight, never complete, always layered. This is why so much African knowledge feels indirect. Proverbs instead of commandments, myths instead of manuals, symbols instead of slogans. Outsiders mistook this for confusion. In reality, it was filtration. Only those willing to sit, observe, and return earned deeper access. Modern culture struggles with this approach. Everything is expected to be instant, clear, consumable. But ancestral systems weren't built for consumption. They were built for transformation. You didn't learn the truth. You grew into it, slowly, sometimes uncomfortably. And as more people begin sensing that not all answers should be loud, the old method starts making sense again. Perhaps the next stage of remembrance isn't about revealing everything, but about relearning how to listen. Because the quietest knowledge often carries the longest shadow into what comes next. The last thing the old traditions warned about was imitation without understanding. Symbols copied without initiation lose their balance. Power borrowed without context turns brittle. That's why so many later civilizations adopted African forms, the sun disk, the obelisk, the pyramid, yet struggled to reproduce their stability. Structure without spirit only lasts so long. History shows this pattern clearly. Empires rose fast on appropriated knowledge, then collapsed under their own weight. The architecture remained impressive, the philosophy less so. Control replaced alignment, law replaced rhythm. And the sun, once a guide, became a banner, useful for authority, disconnected from humility. African systems were slower by design. They prioritized continuity over expansion. A city that outgrew its balance was considered a failure, not a success. That mindset doesn't translate well into conquest-driven narratives, which may explain why it was quietly sidelined rather than studied. Even today, fragments of that imbalance echo globally. Technologies advance faster than wisdom. Information spreads faster than discernment. It's the same ancient mistake, just louder, and somewhere in that noise, the old warning still hums. Progress without grounding always circles back as crisis, which raises the next question the elders would ask softly. If the world keeps repeating the same imbalance, maybe the issue isn't lack of innovation. Maybe it's the absence of an older orientation, one that knew when to grow, when to pause, and when to listen to the sun before moving forward. By the time the story reaches this point, the elders would lower their voices, not for drama, but for accuracy, because the most guarded truth was never about origin or power. It was about choice. The children of the sun were taught that awareness comes with a burden. Once you see the pattern, you're responsible for how you move within it. Ancient teachings emphasized alignment over rebellion. You didn't fight broken systems head-on. You outlived them. You built parallel paths, quieter ones. History often mistakes that for passivity. In reality, it was long strategy. Empires burn fast. Memory, when treated carefully, doesn't. This is why so many African contributions seem to reappear after collapse. Mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, philosophy, lost, then rediscovered, then renamed. It's not mystical disappearance, it's patient timing. Knowledge was allowed to sink until conditions were safe enough for it to resurface without being immediately weaponized. Ironically, the modern world now hunts for sustainability, balance, and long-term thinking, principles embedded in these ancient systems all along. Suddenly, elders sound like futurists. Cycles matter again. Limits matter again. Listening to land and light is no longer primitive, just necessary. And that's where the story pauses, not ends. Because if survival was never the goal, but continuity was, then the real inheritance of the children of the sun isn't behind us. It's unfolding quietly right now, in the decisions being made about what kind of future is worth remembering. The elders say some stories don't end. They return. They circle back when the world is ready to hear them without fear, without hunger for control. The legacy of the children of the sun was never about ruling others, but about remembering balance between land and spirit, power and humility, light and shadow. Africa was never silent. Its wisdom slept beneath rituals, rhythms, ruins, and bloodlines that refused to forget. What was buried wasn't lost, it was protected, waiting for a time when memory could rise again without being chained. Even now, many mysteries remain untouched, resting under the sand of time, beneath forests, rivers, and forgotten cities. Not because they cannot be found, but because revelation requires readiness. The sun still rises over the same land, carrying the same codes, asking the same ancient question: who remembers? If this story stirred something within you, honor that feeling. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and stay with us. Because more truths are waking and more veils are thinning. What we revealed today is only one fragment of a much greater inheritance. The story continues. And so does the remembering.